I was at a coffee shop in Jakarta the other day, kind of eavesdropping, on the table next to me. They were debating the new government's direction. And this one man, gesturing really emphatically, said, it's simple. Indonesia just needs to be neutral. Stay out of it. Don't pick America. Don't pick China. Just stay in the middle. And everyone around him was nodding, like this was just the most obvious common sense thing in the world. But then the conversation kind of drifted. The same man started complaining about the economy. We absolutely must get more of that infrastructure money from Beijing, he insisted. We'd be stupid not to. And then maybe 5 minutes later, a news clip pops up on the TV showing a joint military drill. Ah, this, he says, pointing, this is what we need. We need that advanced tech from the Americans to protect our islands. I sat there listening. He wanted to be completely neutral, right? But he also passionately wanted to engage deeply with both sides. It was this fascinating contradiction, that idea of being free from everyone, but also active with everyone. Well, it isn't really neutrality at all, is it? It's something else entirely.
That anecdote is just perfect. It really is. You've captured the absolute core of Indonesian foreign policy, that practical contradiction right at the heart of the doctrine we're looking at today, Bebas, Aktif.
Which translates to free and active.
Exactly. And as the man in the coffee shop, and maybe his friends too, seem to misunderstand, it's so often mistaken for simple neutrality or, just non-alignment. But really, fundamentally, it's about maximizing your independence while proactively engaging with the world.
And that's our mission today, isn't it? We're doing a deep dive into this foundational doctrine. We really need to unpack its history, those deep roots, how it's been constantly redefined over, 75 years now?
75 years, yeah. It's remarkable.
And crucially, how it's being applied today. How is Indonesia actually using Bebas Aktif to navigate this really intense U.S.-China rivalry, especially now with the new administration under President Prabowo settling in?
Okay, so maybe let's just quickly break down the two parts just to set the stage properly. Bebas. That means free or independent. It gives Indonesia the freedom to figure out its own foreign policy stance, without being tied to any particular power bloc, without outside intervention. It's that core idea of national autonomy.
Okay, Bebas free.
And then you have active. That's the mandate part. It means taking a proactive role in the world, promoting peace, trying to resolve conflicts diplomatically, contributing to development. And what's really extraordinary, as you said, 75 years, it's survived every regime change since 1948.
Wow.
It's still the unchallengeable doctrinal basis for Indonesian foreign policy.
Yeah.
And the reason it survived is because it's so flexible. It's amenable to being redefined whenever needed.
Okay, let's dig into that history then. Because to understand why it's so flexible now, we have to go back to its birth, right?
Right.
Back to September 1948. The Republic was brand new, really struggling.
That's exactly right. The concept was first properly laid out by Prime Minister Mohammad Hatta. And the context, as you said, was the very beginning of the Cold War. This intense rivalry was just starting up between the U.S.-led West and the Soviet-led East.
Two big blocks.
The two big blocks. And Hatta famously described Indonesia's position with this metaphor, mendayung di antara dua karang, which means rowing between two reefs. The choice looked stark. Join the capitalists or join the communists. Hatta said, no, we do neither.
And this wasn't just about, abstract international relations. I find the domestic angle here really fascinating.
Oh, it was absolutely critical. You have to remember, newly independent Indonesia was like a pressure cooker of different ideologies. Yeah. You had powerful secular nationalists, very strong Islamic nationalists, and a really substantial communist party, the PKI.
Big facts.
Huge factions. And if the government had openly sided with, say, the U.S. or with the Soviet Union, it would have basically handed a massive political weapon to its domestic rivals. It could have instantly destabilized the whole project of national unity, which was incredibly fragile back then.
So by choosing this independent path globally,
Hatta essentially took foreign alignment off the table as the domestic political football. He made it a point of national consensus, not internal conflict.
So that Bebas, the free part, it sounds less like some lofty ideal and more like, a hard-nosed strategic calculation.
It was absolutely pragmatic realism applied directly to what the nation needed to survive. Hatta himself defined Bebas Aktif as a quality of policy. It means you define your national interests yourself. Independently, that's the Bebas part, and then you pursue them. Practically, that's the Aktif part.
And he had practical reasons not to join a bloc.
Very practical. He argued, look, if we join the Soviet bloc, we antagonize powerful capitalist countries right in our neighborhood, potential trading partners. And maybe even more critically at that moment, Joining either bloc could prevent Indonesia from trying to leverage capitalist countries against the Netherlands.
Because the Dutch were still fighting to reclaim Indonesia.
Exactly. They were still receiving aid. Hatta wanted to be free to try and stop that aid flow. So Bebas Aktif wasn't passive neutrality. It was a strategy designed to give Indonesia the maximum possible diplomatic wiggle room in a really hostile, unbalanced global power structure.
And history shows just how sensitive this balancing act was. It didn't take long for things to go wrong, did it? There was a cabinet collapse pretty early on. Tell us about that, the 1952 incident.
Ah, yes, the fall of the Sukuman cabinet in 1952. That's really the classic example of how rigid the interpretation was initially. What happened was the cabinet signed the Mutual Security Act, the MSA, with the United States.
For aid, presumably? Economic, military?
Primarily, yes. They needed the economic help. They needed the military equipment. But back in the early 1950s, the interpretation of Bebas Aktif was extremely strict. It basically ruled out any bilateral agreement that could even look like it was tying Indonesia politically or militarily to one of the superpower blocs. The no pacts idea was absolute then.
So because the MSA implied Indonesia was aligning with U.S. security goals in the region, it crossed the line.
Precisely. The political opposition immediately framed it as a betrayal of the nation's Bebas status. It looked like Indonesia was becoming a pawn of the West. The political outcry was just overwhelming, and the cabinet had no choice but to resign.
Wow. So that set a really strong precedent.
It absolutely did. A powerful, long-lasting precedent. Foreign policy decisions must never create the perception of dependence on a single superpower, because that perception could become a lethal weapon in domestic politics. That memory really hung over governments for decades.
Okay, so that's the Bebas side, getting tested early. But then we see the active dimension really start to come alive, moving the policy beyond just, avoiding alliances, towards actually trying to lead on the global stage. And that really seems to crystallize with the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung in 1955.
Bandung was absolutely transformational. Indonesia hosted it, brought together newly independent nations from across Asia and Africa. It was this incredible moment where these nations collectively stood up and said, we're not going to be dominated by the Cold War superpowers. An old man in Bandung once told me, reflecting on it, he said the conference was really about dignity, about the right to define your own future after centuries under colonial rule. It was a powerful assertion of political agency.
And it wasn't just a one-off meeting, was it? It actually led to something bigger, the non-aligned movement, NAM.
Yes, exactly. The principles hammered out there, what became known as the Bandung spirit, formed the philosophical bedrock of the non-aligned movement. Now, some analysts might say NAM became irrelevant after the Cold War ended, after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Sure, the two reefs were gone in a way.
Right. But NAM survived. And its survival actually proves it still had strategic relevance. It sort of repurposed itself. It shifted from resisting a bipolar world to acting as a collective voice against, say, unipolar dominance or any kind of singular hegemony. And remember, NAM countries represent over half the world's population.
Still a significant bloc.
A very significant voice for Global South solidarity and agency. And Indonesia continued to play a really important leadership role within NAM. It chaired the movement from 1992 to 1995, for instance, and was actively involved in mediating conflicts like the war in Bosnia. That's a clear, continuing demonstration of the active commitment in action.
Okay, so that brings us to the next major phase, the second big redefinition maybe, the shift under the New Order government starting around 1966. We move from Sukarno's more confrontational style to Suharto's economic pragmatism. If the 50s were about avoiding dependence, the New Order suggests to be about selectively embracing engagement but for growth.
Absolutely. President Sukarno's later period, which involved things like the Crush Malaysia campaign or his attempts to build a Jakarta-Peking axis, that was denounced by the incoming New Order regime as penyelewengan, basically a deviation, a wrong path for the doctrine.
So they reset the definition.
They reset it. The New Order's absolute top priority was pembangunan economic development. Foreign policy was consciously repositioned, it became a low-profile tool, something to be used quietly, primarily to support domestic economic reconstruction. The idea was to focus inward until Indonesia achieved what they called national vitality.
So the rhetoric shifted from emphasizing independence to emphasizing development. And that must have allowed for a lot more flexibility in seeking foreign money and expertise.
Tremendous flexibility. You had technocrats in Suharto's cabinet who basically summed up the New Order view like this. Bebas Aktif means we are free to make our own decision as to how we can best meet our national needs at a given time. That was essentially a green light for pragmatic maneuvering.
So they needed Western help.
They needed Western aid. They needed investment. So they actively courted the capitalist bloc. They helped create forums like the Intergovernmental Group on Indonesia, the IGGI, later the CGI, specifically to coordinate huge amounts of foreign assistance. So it was very active foreign policy, but the activity was focused squarely on economic goals.
And that framework, that shift, explains how the Doctrine managed to survive Suharto's 3 decades in power, even though it was being interpreted so differently. It wasn't a political battleground anymore.
That structural change is absolutely key. Unlike the Sukarno era, the New Order government really centralized control over foreign policymaking. They minimized the space for public opposition or for political factions to use foreign policy as a weapon against the regime.
Less debate, more control.
Exactly. Because the government faced much less domestic political challenge on this front, the principle of Bebas Aktif didn't need constant ideological defense. It just became this flexible umbrella concept that could justify pretty much whatever strategic actions the state decided were necessary for its external interests.
Which brings us to maybe the ultimate stress test for this new flexibility. 1995, the Agreement on Maintaining Security, the AMS, with Australia. Now, for foreign observers steeped in that Cold War, no pacts history, this must have looked like a bombshell. Indonesia's first formal security arrangement since independence. It seemed like a total violation.
It was definitely a very significant diplomatic move and it raised eyebrows internationally. The AMS involved things like regular ministerial meetings on security issues, and it required both countries to consult if there were adverse challenges facing either one. It certainly had the appearance, the structure of a security alliance.
And Indonesia needed it, partly for regional reasons. East Timor was still a major issue then.
Partly, yes. Managing regional tensions, including those related to East Timor, was certainly a factor.
Okay, but domestically, compared to the absolute meltdown over the MSA back in '52, the AMS seems to have flown relatively under the radar. Why did the Indonesian public and the political elite accept this agreement when the earlier one caused a government to fall?
Well, that contrast perfectly illustrates just how dramatically the Doctrine's interpretation and the political context had shifted. The government officials were very careful. They deliberately avoided any big public debate about redefining Bebas Aktif itself.
So they didn't say Bebas Aktif means something different now?
No, not at all. Instead, they drew a very fine line. They framed the AMS strictly as security cooperation. They insisted it was just about formalizing defense ties that already existed, bilaterally. And they were emphatic. This is not a military pact. By carefully controlling the narrative and keeping the debate contained, the new order showed it could stretch the meaning of Bebas Aktif to cover actions needed for the national interest, all while keeping the doctrine itself formally intact. It was a masterclass in pragmatism and flexibility.
Okay, so let's fast forward. We've gone from Hattas to reefs in the Cold War. Now today, the challenge isn't scarcity of powers. Maybe it's an overabundance. Too many players wanting Jakarta's attention, wanting influence. That rowing between two reefs metaphor feels inadequate now.
It really does. We are definitely in a multipolar world now. Maybe Hatta's metaphor needs an update. Mendiang di antara banyak orang rowing, between many reefs. Yes, the US and China are the most prominent reefs, absolutely. But Indonesia also have to navigate the powerful currents of globalism, rising nationalism, especially resource nationalism, the huge demands of environmentalism, climate change.
And those intermestic issues.
Exactly. Those issues where global policy directly impacts domestic life. Things like digital sovereignty, data flows, even human rights debates. It's incredibly complex. Now, this complexity actually increases Indonesia's potential influence as a key middle power, but it also multiplies the dangers, the chances of getting caught on a reef.
Which brings us right up to the present day and the strategy under President Prabowo Subianto. It's often described using this phrase, strategic pragmatism. We can see this playing out across different sectors, can't we?
We can. You mentioned the coffee shop anecdote earlier about wanting tech from the US and money from China. That captures the economic dimension perfectly.
Yeah, I was reading about a specific example, actually. A tech startup in Jakarta doing supply chain software. Let's call the founder Rina. Her company apparently got its early funding, quite a lot of it, from a Chinese VC firm. That went on for a couple of years.
Okay, Salmon scenario.
Right. But then recently, a U.S. delegation came through talking about partnerships in, secure technology, reliable digital infrastructure. And Rinna was describing the tension in her office. Her CEO is now flying back and forth, trying to land American clients, but being really careful not to upset the Chinese investors. She apparently said something like, "Look, we just want to build good tech, but we're caught in their great power game. Our bosses keep telling us we have to be Bebas Aktif, smart, free, active, take the best bits from both, but never really belong to either side."
That story perfectly illustrates both the pressure and the opportunity that Indonesian businesses and the government face. Prabowo's interpretation of Bebas Aktif really emphasizes strong sovereignty, backed up by strong defense. He stresses that defense is crucial for ensuring national sovereignty and insists Indonesia must not be a lackey of anyone.
That's a bit strong.
Strong words reflecting a blend of nationalist sentiment and, strategic pragmatism in action. The core strategy seems to be secure the widest possible maneuvering room, collaborate economically, collaborate on security with everyone, the US, China, Europe, Russia, whoever. But only as long as that collaboration clearly supports Indonesia's core national interests, no dependency.
So how does this strategic pragmatism actually work in practice when it comes to the big one, the US-China Balancing Act? Where are the specific pressure points or trade-offs?
Well, you can see the pressure points quite clearly if you look at some of the internal data surveys of the Indonesian elite, for instance. Economically, perhaps surprisingly to some, these elites have actually shown increasing confidence in China's leadership over the last couple of years, say 2022 to 2023.
Really? Despite global narratives?
Yes, but it seems very transactional, very results-oriented. It appears driven by the tangible economic benefits that Beijing delivers trade volumes, massive infrastructure investment, through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. It's concrete.
But does that translate to alignment?
Not necessarily, and this is crucial. The Indonesian elites remain remarkably flexible, or perhaps hedging. When they're asked in surveys, hypothetically, if you are forced to choose US or China, they split almost down the middle, something like 53-54% leaning China, 46-47% leaning US.
That's incredibly close.
It's incredibly close. And that near-even split is actually a source of strength for the government. It gives Jakarta enormous leverage with both Washington and Beijing because neither side can ever be fully sure which way Indonesia might lean if push really came to shove.
But there's often a gap, isn't there, between elite views focused on economics and broader public sentiment, especially about foreign influence. You mentioned surveys suggesting some public anxiety.
Exactly right. Separate surveys looking at ordinary Indonesian citizens sometimes reveal, less positive perceptions of their relationship with China. There's often a degree of public anxiety about China's growing influence.
What kinds of anxieties?
They tend to center on the perceived risks of these large infrastructure projects. Concerns about debt traps, maybe, or the use of foreign labor, or the environmental impacts associated with some BRI projects. So the Prabowo administration has this domestic political balancing act, too. It needs the investment from China, but it has to constantly demonstrate that these deals serve Indonesian interests first and foremost and address those public concerns.
Okay, that's the economic side. What about security? It seems just as complex. Indonesia is naturally wary of, say, large U.S. military footprints in the region, but at the same time, it seems to need the U.S. and its allies as a kind of security backstop.
That's the absolute classic security dilemma for a middle power caught between giants. Indonesia absolutely needs the support, diplomatic and sometimes implicitly military, of the U.S. and its allies like Australia and Japan to counterbalance China's increasing assertiveness, especially in the South China Sea. Those incursions near Indonesia's Natuna Islands are a major concern.
Also Natunas.
But at the same time, Jakarta is very careful not to get pulled into any kind of formal U.S.-led coalition or alliance structure that could compromise its Bebas, its independent status. That deep-seated wariness was really clear in how Indonesia responded very cautiously to Beijing's own big strategic idea, the Global Security Initiative, or GSI.
The GSI is interesting, isn't it? Because it signals China moving beyond just economic ties to offering a kind of alternative security vision for the region. Why was Jakarta's response so well restrained?
Indonesia's official public response was basically just that it takes note of the GSI. That phrasing is very deliberate, very diplomatic.
Takes note. Sounds non-committal.
Highly non-committal. It signals a sort of reserved acknowledgement, maybe even slight acceptance, because some aspects of the GSI, like emphasizing non-interference, rejecting formal military alliances, actually align quite well, on paper, with Bebas Aktif principles. However, the GSI is also clearly designed to push back against U.S.-led alliances in Asia.
So Indonesia didn't want to look like it was endorsing Beijing's security framework over Washington's.
Precisely. Jakarta wants to avoid signaling any kind of alignment with China's broader security vision for the region. That restraint is a calculated move to maintain maximum strategic distance from both sides. By simply taking note, Indonesia keeps the door open. It preserves the flexibility to continue its own defense cooperation with the U.S., with Australia, with others, maintaining that crucial security hedge, especially concerning those contested waters around the Natunas.
Okay, let's pivot then and focus fully on the active component, the active part. This is where Indonesia steps out as a middle power leader, primarily through ASEAN, right? ASEAN centrality seems absolutely fundamental to Jakarta's entire regional strategy.
It really is the linchpin. Indonesia is, let's face it, the de facto leader of ASEAN just because of its sheer size, population, economic weight. Yeah. And it uses that position consistently to try and ensure that ASEAN remains the main platform, the central mechanism for regional dialogue and security architecture in Southeast Asia.
We've seen that in the past, haven't we? When Indonesia chaired ASEAN.
Definitely. Think back to its chairmanship in 2011. Indonesia engaged in very active shuttle diplomacy to help manage that difficult border conflict between Cambodia and Thailand over the Preah Vihear temple. And perhaps even more importantly, strategically, it was Indonesia that initiated the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the AOIP.
And the AOIP is meant to be?
It's meant to be ASEAN's own homegrown counter-narrative to all these external Indo-Pacific strategies being pushed by the U.S., Japan, India, and others. It's ASEAN trying to stay in the driver's seat.
But that driver's seat, that ASEAN centrality, it feels like it's under real pressure today. You've got these new security groupings popping up: the Quad, U.S., Australia, Japan, India, the AUKUS pact, Australia, UK, US.
The threat of erosion is very real, and Jakarta is extremely vigilant about it. Now, interestingly, the general regional response to the Quad has actually been fairly constructive, or at least not overly negative. Many countries, including Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia itself, have acknowledged the Quad's positive contributions in areas like vaccine distribution or climate cooperation.
So they see some value.
They see some value in its functional cooperation. However, there's deep-seated wariness in Jakarta and elsewhere in ASEAN about being sidelined. These new groupings, Quad, AUKUS, they operate outside the traditional IESN-led frameworks. The risk is that they create parallel structures, potentially dominated by great powers, that bypass ASEAN altogether and diminish Jakarta's regional influence.
So Indonesia constantly pushes back.
Constantly. It works tirelessly to recenter the regional conversation, always arguing that the ASEAN Outlook, the AOIP, must be the primary guiding document for regional security architecture, not these external alliance-like structures. That fear of ASEAN being bypassed is a really powerful driver in Indonesian foreign policy right now.
And we also have to talk about the South China Sea Code of Conduct, the KOC negotiations. As you mentioned, Indonesia isn't technically a claimant state in the territorial disputes, but it faces those recurring problems with Chinese vessels, especially around the Natuna Islands.
Yes, the Natuna Sea incidents are a major flashpoint. You have Chinese Coast Guard vessels, sometimes even fishing fleets escorted by them, asserting jurisdiction in waters that Indonesia claims as its legitimate exclusive economic zone, its EEZ, under international law. This puts huge pressure on Jakarta.
How does it respond?
Well, Indonesia always emphasizes diplomacy first, dialogue with Beijing, but these incidents also require a firm, active response to uphold sovereignty. So you see Indonesia investing more in its own Coast Guard and naval presence around the Natunas. And crucially, within ASEAN, Indonesia is expected to push hard, really intensify the negotiations for a legally binding code of conduct for the South China Sea.
A binding COC being the goal.
That's the goal. It's a classic application of the Aktif dimension, using multilateral diplomacy, strengthening regional rules and norms as a way to try and manage and constrain the actions of more powerful states like China.
You know, the Aktif dimension, it really seems to shine when you look at how Indonesia engages in global crises or takes on leadership roles. Thinking back to the mid-90s, the peacekeeping missions in Bosnia, I read this really moving account from a Bosnian woman talking about the Indonesian contingent there, the Garuda peacekeepers.
Ah, yes, the Garuda contingents have a long history.
She described this contrast between how they operated compared to, say, American or European forces. She said it felt like genuine solidarity, coming from a country that maybe understood complex, multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies better. She even mentioned how the Indonesian soldiers actively helped rebuild a local mosque in their off hours. It wasn't just military presence, it felt constructive, non-imposing.
That story beautifully captures the essence of the global role Indonesia often aspires to. The Aktif commitment, ideally, isn't about projecting raw power. It's about constructive engagement. It's about solidarity, especially with other nations in the global south, based on shared experiences, perhaps.
And we see that playing out today, too.
Absolutely. Look at the crisis in Myanmar. Indonesia has really pushed for multiple avenues, trying to foster dialogue with all the stakeholders, including reaching out to the National Unity Government, the NUG, which opposes the military junta. Jakarta also pushed for establishing a dedicated office for the ASEAN Special Envoy on Myanmar. It's trying to keep diplomatic channels open, however difficult.
And on the truly global stage, Indonesia's G20 presidency recently was a huge platform for displaying this Aktif doctrine, wasn't it? Navigating everything from pandemics to geopolitics.
It absolutely was. The war in Ukraine presented a massive challenge right in the middle of its presidency. President Joko Widodo, Jokowi, actually became the first ASEAN leader to travel and meet with both President Zelensky in Kyiv and President Putin in Moscow, explicitly trying to broker peace or at least open dialogue.
A difficult balancing act.
Incredibly difficult. But that active diplomatic role, which also involved Jakarta skillfully facilitating a joint G20 leaders statement that did condemn Russia's aggression, despite divisions within the G20 that earned significant domestic approval in Indonesia, it showed Indonesia playing on the world stage.
And beyond the immediate crises, the Aktif role seems to extend to longer-term global development issues, institution building, areas really important to the global south.
Exactly. During that G20 presidency, Indonesia showed real leadership in global health diplomacy, for instance, successfully raising $1.4 billion for the new pandemic fund. And perhaps even more significantly, it secured that huge $20 billion just energy transition partnership deal, the JETP.
The climate finance deal.
Yes. A landmark deal in climate diplomacy aimed at helping Indonesia pivot away from coal towards renewables. That's proactive leadership on a critical global issue. And closer to home, you also see this commitment to regional stability and institution building in Indonesia's very strong, consistent support for Timor-Leste finally joining ASEAN. For some, that's seen as fulfilling a kind of historical, moral obligation to its neighbor and former territory.
A way of closing a chapter?
Perhaps. And even the theme Indonesia chose for its last ASEAN chairmanship, ASEAN Matters, epicentrum of growth, that was a clear signal. The Aktif dimension today is heavily focused on driving economic recovery, regional prosperity, and strengthening ASEAN's own institutional capacity to manage challenges.
So if we try to pull it all together, looking back over this whole 75-year journey of Bebas Aktif, from Hatta's very pragmatic need to survive between two reefs, right up to Prabowo's strategic pragmatism today, the defining characteristic seems to be its incredible fluidity, not rigidity.
That really is the key takeaway. That's the ultimate strategic value of this doctrine. It survived precisely because it isn't a rigid, fixed ideology. It's a doctrine of, well, ultimate flexibility. Its ability to endure through so many different regimes with such different priorities is because it can be constantly reinterpreted and adapted. It's allowed Indonesian leaders to pursue strategies ranging from near strict neutrality at one point to formalized security cooperation at another.
And under the current administration, we see this manifesting as that strategic pragmatism, emphasizing defense self-reliance, yes, but also actively seeking economic benefits from absolutely all sides, ensuring Indonesia stays independent but deeply connected globally.
Right. And that structural shift we talked about earlier, the government's much tighter control over foreign policy making compared to the early decades, that's what underpins this flexibility today. The principle of Bebas Aktif doesn't really need constant redefinition or public defense anymore to survive. It simply functions as a permissive framework. It allows the state to take whatever strategic actions it deems necessary to advance its external interests, largely shielded from the kind of destructive domestic political opposition that crippled the Sukuman government back in 1952.
So it's that unique ability to keep an independent distance, the Bebas, while simultaneously engaging deeply and actively the Aktif with the U.S., with China, with regional partners within global institutions. That's what makes it work.
That blend of independence and engagement, policy mixed with pragmatism and flexibility, is precisely why Bebas Aktif remains the cornerstone, the unchallengeable foundation of Indonesia's strategy for navigating today's very complex and contested global order.